47 seconds. That's how long it took for America's most powerful judge to see his hand tremble, his voice falter, and a nation to hold its breath. Jasmine Crockett asked Chief Justice Roberts just one question, but that question shook the entire Supreme Court system. In those 47 seconds, a legend was born, and an authority's mask fell away. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building had hosted thousands of congressional hearings over the decades, but the atmosphere on this particular Tuesday morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany panels and marble floors. Every seat was filled, every camera was rolling, and every person in that room understood they were about to witness something that would define American politics for years to come. The subject was judicial ethics, a topic that had become increasingly uncomfortable for the Supreme Court as scandal after scandal had chipped away at the institution's carefully cultivated image of impartiality and integrity. Questions about undisclosed gifts, luxury vacations funded by billionaire benefactors, and financial relationships that seemed to influence judicial decisions had reached a crescendo that even the court's traditional cloak of secrecy could no longer hide. Chief Justice John Roberts sat at the witness table with the bearing of a man who had never doubted his place in the hierarchy of American power. His navy suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression carried the kind of controlled confidence that comes from 3 decades of wielding judicial authority. He had testified before Congress several times throughout his career, and each appearance had reinforced his reputation as someone who could navigate political pressure while maintaining the dignity and independence that Americans expected from their highest court. But Chief Justice Roberts had never faced anyone quite like Jasmine Crockett. As the hearing began, the early questions from committee members followed the predictable patterns of congressional theater. Republican members lobbed softball inquiries that allowed Roberts to recite well-rehearsed talking points about judicial independence and constitutional interpretation. Democratic members pressed harder on specific ethical controversies, but their questions often got bogged down in procedural details and legal technicalities that allowed Roberts to deflect with lawyerly precision. Through it all, Jasmine sat quietly at her position on the committee, reviewing her notes with the methodical focus of someone preparing for the most important cross-examination of her career. Her colleagues might have seen this as just another hearing, but Jasmine understood it as something far more significant, a rare opportunity to hold the most powerful court in America accountable to the people it was supposed to serve. When her time finally came, the room subtly shifted. Conversations quieted, staff members looked up from their phones, and even the most seasoned political observers leaned forward in their chairs. There was something about Jasmine's presence that commanded attention without demanding it, a quiet authority that came from years of fighting for justice in courtrooms where the odds were always stacked against her clients. "Chief Justice Roberts," she began, her voice carrying the clear, measured tone that had made her legendary in Texas legal circles. "You've stated in previous testimony that the Supreme Court follows a strict standard of ethical conduct even in the absence of an official ethics code. Is that correct?" It seemed like a straightforward question, the kind of softball that Roberts had been fielding all morning. He smiled with the practiced ease of someone who had answered variations of this question dozens of times before. "That is correct, Congresswoman," he replied, his hands clasped comfortably on the table before him. "The members of the court adhere to principles that have long guided judicial behavior, principles that are more important than any written code because they reflect our commitment to the highest standards of integrity." Jasmine nodded, making a note on her legal pad with deliberate precision. "So, help me understand," she continued, "if that's the case, why was there no disclosure about the relationship between Justice Thomas and the political donor whose case came before the court just last year?" The question hit like a perfectly aimed arrow. Robert's smile flickered for just a moment, and those watching closely could see the slight adjustment in his posture as he shifted from comfortable deflection to defensive positioning. This wasn't a general inquiry about ethical principles. It was a specific challenge based on documented facts. I'm not at liberty to comment on ongoing ethical reviews or specifics related to individual justices, Roberts replied, his voice still controlled but lacking the easy confidence of moments before. Right, Jasmine said, looking down briefly at her notes before returning her gaze to Roberts with laser focus. But you can speak on precedent, correct? Yes? Great, she said, her tone sharpening just enough to signal that the real questioning was about to begin. Because from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Supreme Court has historically used the appearance of impropriety as a benchmark. That it's not just about whether something is technically wrong, it's about whether the public has reason to believe something might be wrong. Roberts shifted slightly in his chair, recognizing that he was being maneuvered into a position where any answer would create problems. The appearance standard has guided many institutions, yes. Jasmine didn't wait for him to elaborate. Then wouldn't failing to disclose a close relationship with someone who financially benefits from a court's decision look improper? She didn't yell, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The room was already silent, hanging on every word. Roberts tried to regain control of the narrative. Congresswoman, I believe we're getting into hypotheticals. I'm not, Jasmine interrupted smoothly. I'm quoting facts from your own court's financial records. The temperature in the room had shifted dramatically, but Jasmine was just getting started. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying not just the recent ethical scandals, but Roberts's own words and speeches stretching back over his entire career. She knew exactly where to find the contradictions that would expose the gap between the court's public rhetoric and its private behavior. Roberts straightened in his chair, one hand resting on the mahogany table, his eyes scanning Jasmine's expression for any sign of what was coming next. But Jasmine's face revealed nothing except unwavering focus. I'm quoting directly from the disclosure forms, Chief Justice, she said again, slower this time, as if daring him to challenge the source. He cleared his throat, a small but telling gesture of discomfort. Those forms are compiled by the court's administrative office, and I trust the process is followed with care. But do you review them? Jasmine asked, her head tilted slightly in a gesture that conveyed both genuine curiosity and prosecutorial intensity. Do you personally make sure what's submitted is transparent and truthful? The pause that followed was brief but telling. In the world of congressional testimony, hesitation is often more damaging than any answer could be. There is a system in place, Roberts replied carefully. Each justice is responsible for their own disclosures. Jasmine sat back in her chair, letting the silence do the work for her. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of incredulity that resonated throughout the room. Interesting, she said, because where I come from, if you're responsible for your own oversight, you're not being held accountable. You're just checking your own work. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. One staffer let out a barely audible exhale that was half laugh, half disbelief. The metaphor was so simple, so clear, that even those with no legal background immediately understood the absurdity of the Supreme Court's approach to ethical oversight. Roberts tried to redirect the conversation to safer ground. Respectfully, Congresswoman, the judiciary was designed to function independently of the legislative and executive branches. Our role is to interpret the law, not to be governed by political pressure. It was a classic deflection, the kind of appeal to constitutional principle that usually ended uncomfortable lines of questioning. But Jasmine was ready for it. And no one here is trying to do that, she replied firmly. We're not trying to tell you how to rule. We're trying to understand why certain patterns keep showing up and why they keep going unchecked. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine held up a hand, not to interrupt, but to frame her next question in a way that would make deflection impossible. I spent years in criminal courtrooms across Texas, she said, her voice taking on a personal intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward. Watching judges lecture young men, black, brown, white, didn't matter, about taking responsibility, about how even the appearance of dishonesty could ruin their lives. So forgive me if I don't buy that the nation's highest court can't be held to a similar standard. The room was completely silent now. Jasmine had just connected the abstract question of judicial ethics to the concrete reality of how justice actually worked for ordinary Americans. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Young defendants were held to impossibly high standards, while Supreme Court justices operated under no binding ethical rules whatsoever. Roberts shifted his posture again, and those watching closely could see that his composure was beginning to crack. "Congresswoman, I do understand your point, but we've always taken concerns seriously and responded with internal review." "You have no binding code," Jasmine cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice through his prepared talking points, "and the only review comes from inside the House." She paused for just a moment, letting the implication settle before delivering the line that would define the entire hearing. "That's like asking a fox to file a security report on the henhouse." The metaphor landed with devastating effect. There was a low murmur in the back of the room, the sound of recognition spreading through an audience that finally understood exactly how broken the Supreme Court's approach to ethics really was. Cameras clicked faster, reporters leaned forward in their chairs, and Roberts found himself facing the kind of scrutiny that his position had previously made him immune to. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had been building toward this moment for weeks, and she had one more weapon in her arsenal that would prove decisive. "In 2013, she said, pulling out a document that she had clearly studied extensively, "you gave a commencement speech at Harvard Law School. You told the graduates, and I quote, 'Your credibility is your currency. The moment people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses.'" Roberts nodded slowly, recognizing his own words but unable to see where Jasmine was leading him. "That's correct." "Then tell me," she said, her voice dropping to a register that somehow made every word more powerful, "how does credibility survive when public trust in your institution is at its lowest point in decades? When polls show that more Americans believe the court is driven by politics than by principle?" The question hung in the air like a judgment. Roberts didn't answer immediately, and his silence spoke louder than any response could have. Jasmine pressed forward, building on the foundation she had just laid. "You don't get to spend 20 years building a reputation and then act surprised when the silence around your colleagues starts cracking it open," she continued, her voice gaining strength and moral authority with every word. "You called this passion. It's not. It's precision. I'm not yelling. I'm not speculating. I'm asking why Americans like the families I've represented are held to standards your justices can ignore in plain sight." She shifted her tone, making it more personal and therefore more devastating. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a courtroom knowing the scales are tilted before you even speak?" "I do. I've watched young men cry after being sentenced because they knew they never had a real shot, because justice was never about truth. It was about who had access, who had ties, who had time." The silence in the room was dense now, heavy with the weight of truth that couldn't be deflected or dismissed. Roberts tried to recover, but his usual tactics were failing him. "The court has taken steps," he began. Jasmine cut him off with surgical precision. "Not enough. Not when billionaires fly justices to private resorts and no one blinks. Not when you write decisions that impact millions from behind doors no one can knock on." And then she delivered the line that would be replayed on every news network in America for the next week. "You're right about one thing," she said, looking directly into Roberts' eyes with unwavering intensity. "Credibility is currency. And right now, your institution is in overdraft." The impact was immediate and visible. Roberts reached for his water glass, and his hand, the steady hand that had signed countless opinions and wielded judicial power for nearly 2 decades, trembled. It was barely noticeable, a tremor that lasted only a second, but Jasmine caught it. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in his tenure as Chief Justice, John Roberts had been held truly accountable by someone who couldn't be intimidated, deflected, or dismissed. Jasmine had used his own words, his own standards, and his own institution's principles to expose the hypocrisy that had been hidden behind judicial robes and constitutional rhetoric. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged with recognition. Recognition that a former public defender from Texas had just accomplished what senators, representatives, and legal scholars had been unable to do for years. She had stripped away the mystique of judicial authority and revealed it for what it had become: power without accountability, privilege without responsibility. Roberts didn't reach for a rebuttal because there wasn't one. The facts were undeniable, the logic was unassailable, and the moral authority behind Jasmine's questions was unshakable. He just sat still, processing the reality that his carefully constructed image of judicial independence had been systematically dismantled by someone who understood both the law and the human cost of its failures. Representative Leonard Franks, a veteran from Arizona who rarely weighed in during hearings, leaned toward his microphone and muttered, "Damn, it wasn't a policy statement or a partisan comment. It was recognition of excellence, the kind of moment when even political opponents had to acknowledge superior skill and preparation." Jasmine didn't react to the praise because she wasn't there for applause. She was there to do what she had always done: fight for people who had been failed by systems that were supposed to protect them. The young men she had represented in Texas courtrooms, the families who had been crushed by a justice system that treated their lives as disposable. They were all represented in that room through her voice and her unwavering commitment to accountability. Chairman Bledsoe finally spoke, his voice slower and more cautious than usual. "The committee thanks Representative Crockett for her line of questioning." Even he seemed hesitant to rush to the next segment, understanding that something significant had just occurred that deserved to be processed rather than simply moved past. As the hearing continued, Roberts responded differently to subsequent questions. His answers were shorter, less theoretical, more careful. The easy confidence that had characterized his earlier testimony was gone, replaced by the wariness of someone who had been reminded that power without accountability is not strength. It's vulnerability waiting to be exposed. Outside the building, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Video clips of Jasmine's questioning were spreading across social media platforms faster than political content had any right to move. The credibility as currency exchange was being replayed in coffee shops, barbershops, and living rooms across the country. People who had never watched a congressional hearing in their lives were suddenly sharing clips with commentary like, "She destroyed him," and "This is what accountability looks like." In a classroom in Dallas, a young black girl asked her teacher, "Is she a lawyer?" When the teacher explained that Jasmine had been a public defender before becoming a congresswoman, the girl nodded thoughtfully and said, "I want to do that too." In a barbershop in Detroit, the owner paused mid-haircut to replay the henhouse line, shaking his head in admiration. "Now that's how you talk to power," he said to his customer. "No disrespect, but all facts." In homes across America, people who had stopped believing that their government could be held accountable felt something they hadn't experienced in years: hope that individual courage could still make a difference. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from within the legal community itself. Law professors began incorporating Jasmine's questioning into their ethics courses as an example of how accountability should work. Former prosecutors and defense attorneys posted lengthy analyses of her technique, praising her preparation, her restraint, and her ability to build a case methodically rather than relying on grandstanding or partisan attacks. The American Bar Association, which had remained largely silent about Supreme Court ethics scandals, issued a statement calling for renewed attention to the importance of judicial accountability and transparency. Bar associations in multiple states passed resolutions supporting binding ethics codes for all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. More importantly, the questioning had changed the national conversation about the Supreme Court in ways that would prove lasting. The institution's claims to be above politics and beyond accountability had been exposed as hollow rhetoric that protected privilege rather than principle. Jasmine had shown that the court's power derived not from constitutional authority, but from the willingness of other branches of government to treat it as untouchable. In the weeks that followed, other members of Congress began asking harder questions about judicial ethics. The deference that had traditionally characterized congressional interactions with the Supreme Court gave way to a more demanding approach that treated justices as public servants rather than philosophical kings. Legal scholars who had spent careers defending judicial independence found themselves grappling with Jasmine's central point, that accountability and independence were not contradictory concepts, but complementary ones. A court that operated without ethical constraints was not independent. It was unmoored from the very principles that gave it legitimacy. The impact extended beyond the Supreme Court to the broader question of how power operates in American democracy. Jasmine had demonstrated that preparation, moral clarity, and fearless questioning could still penetrate even the most insulated corridors of power. Her example inspired activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens to demand better from their institutions and their leaders. But for Jasmine herself, the moment represented something more personal and profound. It was validation of the path she had chosen from Texas courtrooms to the halls of Congress, proof that the skills she had developed fighting for marginalized defendants could be deployed on behalf of democratic accountability itself. That evening, as she reviewed the day's events in her Capitol Hill office, Jasmine reflected on the phone calls and messages that had been pouring in from across the country. Former clients thanked her for showing that the system could be challenged. Young lawyers expressed inspiration to pursue public service. Parents told her that their children had watched the hearing and asked questions about justice and accountability. One message particularly stood out, from a retired judge in Houston who had presided over cases where Jasmine had appeared as a defense attorney. "You made us all proud today," he wrote. "That's what courage in the service of justice looks like." The 47 seconds that had made Jasmine Crockett a legend were really the culmination of a lifetime spent fighting for accountability, justice, and the principle that no one, not even the Chief Justice of the United States, should be above the standards they impose on others. In those 47 seconds, she had reminded America that democracy requires constant vigilance, that power unchecked becomes power corrupted, and that sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person brave enough to ask the right questions. The trembling hand, the faltering voice, the mask that fell away. These were not symbols of personal triumph, but of democratic renewal. Jasmine had shown that the system could still be held accountable, that truth could still penetrate privilege, and that individual courage could still reshape the balance of power in American government. As the hearing room emptied and the cameras stopped rolling, the echo of those 47 seconds continued to reverberate through the corridors of power, a reminder that in a democracy, no one is untouchable when faced with citizens brave enough to demand answers and principled enough to fight for them. 3 months after that historic hearing, the reverberations of Jasmine Crockett's 47 seconds continued to reshape American legal and political discourse in ways that even she hadn't anticipated. The Supreme Court, an institution that had operated with virtual impunity for decades, found itself under a level of scrutiny that made its members visibly uncomfortable and fundamentally changed how they approached their public responsibilities. Chief Justice Roberts had returned to his chambers immediately after the hearing, canceling his planned media appearances and retreating into the marble sanctuary of the Supreme Court building. But the walls that had traditionally protected the court from external accountability could no longer shield it from the questions that Jasmine had legitimized through her masterful interrogation. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came just 2 weeks later, when Justice Clarence Thomas voluntarily disclosed financial relationships that he had previously kept hidden from public view. The disclosure, filed with unusual haste and accompanied by what legal observers described as defensive explanations, represented an acknowledgement that the old rules of the game had changed. Thomas's disclosure revealed the extent of his financial entanglements with conservative donors, including luxury vacations worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, private school tuition payments for his nephew, and real estate transactions that involved political activists with cases before the court. The revelations, which came in response to what his spokesperson called clarifying recent public discussions about disclosure standards, were clearly a direct result of the pressure that Jasmine had created. But Thomas's belated transparency only raised more questions about what other justices might be hiding. Within days of his disclosure, investigative journalists who had been working on Supreme Court ethics stories for months suddenly found their editors greenlighting extensive resources for deeper investigations. The Crockett effect, as media insiders began calling it, had created public demand for accountability that made previously untouchable stories suddenly newsworthy. The Washington Post published a devastating three-part series documenting undisclosed relationships between multiple justices and wealthy donors. The series, which won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting 6 months later, traced financial connections that spanned decades and involved justices across the ideological spectrum. The reporting was meticulous, fact-checked to an extraordinary degree, and presented with the kind of sober analysis that made denial impossible. ProPublica followed with an investigation into the Supreme Court's internal financial management, revealing that the court had no systematic process for reviewing justice disclosures and that administrative staff had been instructed to process forms with minimal scrutiny. The investigation found instances where disclosure forms had been filed years late, contained obvious omissions, or included explanations that contradicted publicly available information. More damaging still, internal court communications obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that Roberts himself had been aware of disclosure problems for years, but had chosen to address them through private conversations rather than systematic reforms. The communications revealed a culture of elite protection where accountability was treated as a threat to judicial independence rather than a foundation for institutional legitimacy. The Legal Academy, which had long been reluctant to criticize the Supreme Court directly, found itself energized by Jasmine's example. Law schools across the country began hosting symposiums on judicial ethics, and legal journals dedicated special issues to the question of Supreme Court accountability. The Harvard Law Review, Roberts' own alma mater publication, published a scathing analysis of the court's ethical standards that directly quoted Jasmine's hearing questions and concluded that institutional reform is not just desirable, but essential for maintaining public confidence in judicial decision-making. Perhaps most significantly, the American Bar Association, historically deferential to the Supreme Court, established a special commission to develop binding ethical standards for federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. The commission's formation was announced at the ABA's annual conference, where the keynote speaker directly referenced Jasmine's questioning as evidence that the legal profession can no longer remain silent when our highest court operates under standards that would be unacceptable for any other judicial body. But the impact of Jasmine's confrontation extended far beyond legal circles. The 47 seconds had tapped into a broader public frustration with institutions that seemed accountable to no one but themselves. Social media campaigns demanding Supreme Court ethics reform garnered millions of participants, including celebrities, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who had never previously engaged with judicial issues. The hashtag #credibility is currency became a rallying cry for accountability advocates across multiple issue areas. Citizens used it to demand transparency from corporate executives, university administrators, and government officials who had previously operated with minimal oversight. The phrase transcended its original context to become a general principle for evaluating institutional legitimacy. Congressional Republicans who had initially dismissed Jasmine's questioning as partisan theater found themselves forced to respond to constituent pressure for Supreme Court accountability. Town halls in conservative districts featured questions about judicial ethics, and Republican members found that defending the court's status quo was politically untenable when presented with the facts that Jasmine had assembled. Senator Ted Cruz, who had previously been one of the court's most vocal defenders, quietly introduced legislation requiring annual ethics training for federal judges and quarterly disclosure of financial relationships. The bill, while modest in scope, represented a significant shift for someone who had built his political brand on defending judicial independence from legislative interference. Meanwhile, Jasmine herself had become something of a folk hero among legal reform advocates. Law students wore T-shirts featuring her most quotable lines from the hearing. Public interest organizations competed to recruit attorneys who demonstrated her combination of meticulous preparation and fearless questioning. Most significantly, applications to public defender offices and legal aid organizations spiked dramatically in the months following the hearing, with many applicants specifically citing Jasmine's example as inspiration for pursuing careers in public service law. The Supreme Court's response to this sustained pressure was telling in its defensiveness and ultimate inadequacy. Roberts issued a year-end report on the federal judiciary that devoted unprecedented attention to ethical standards, but the reforms he proposed fell far short of what accountability advocates demanded. The report acknowledged room for improvement in disclosure practices, but resisted binding ethical codes and external oversight mechanisms. More revealing was Roberts's tone in the report, which carried an undercurrent of resentment toward what he characterized as political attacks on judicial independence. The language suggested that Roberts had learned the wrong lesson from his encounter with Jasmine, viewing her accountability demands as threats to be resisted rather than legitimate concerns to be addressed. This defensive posture only reinforced public perception that the Supreme Court was an institution more concerned with protecting its privileges than serving the public interest. Editorial boards across the country, including traditionally conservative publications, criticized Roberts's response as tone-deaf and insufficient. The Wall Street Journal, hardly a bastion of progressive activism, published an editorial titled "Chief Justice, Heal Thyself" that called for meaningful ethics reform rather than defensive deflection. The political ramifications extended into the 2024 election cycle, where Supreme Court reform became a major campaign issue for the first time in decades. Democratic candidates competed to propose the most comprehensive ethics reforms, while Republican candidates found themselves having to defend an institution that was increasingly unpopular with their own voters. Jasmine herself became a sought-after surrogate for candidates who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to governmental accountability. Her endorsements carried particular weight with voters who had lost faith in traditional political institutions, but still believed that individual courage could make a difference. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the 47 seconds was how it changed the relationship between Congress and the Supreme Court. The traditional deference that had characterized legislative interactions with the judicial branch gave way to a more assertive approach that treated justices as public servants subject to legitimate oversight. House Judiciary Committee hearings began featuring more aggressive questioning of federal judges, with Jasmine's technique serving as a model for other members who had previously been intimidated by judicial authority. The Senate Judiciary Committee adopted new procedures for judicial confirmation hearings that included detailed financial disclosure requirements and ethics questionnaires. More importantly, the hearing had established a new standard for what accountability looked like in practice. It wasn't enough for institutions to claim ethical standards. They had to demonstrate them through transparent processes and verifiable compliance. The gap between rhetoric and reality that Jasmine had exposed became a template for examining other institutions that claimed to operate according to high moral standards. Corporate boards found themselves facing shareholder questions modeled on Jasmine's approach. University trustees encountered alumni demands for accountability that echoed her technique. Even religious institutions discovered that their members were less willing to accept claims of moral authority without evidence of ethical behavior. The legal profession itself underwent a period of introspection prompted by Jasmine's example. Bar associations began examining whether their own ethical standards were adequate for maintaining public confidence. Law schools revised their curricula to place greater emphasis on practical ethics and public accountability. Most significantly, the profession began to grapple with its own role in enabling institutional failures through excessive deference to power and privilege. 6 months after the hearing, Roberts made an unprecedented appearance at the American Law Institute's annual meeting, where he delivered a speech that many observers interpreted as an indirect response to Jasmine's criticisms. The speech, titled "Judicial Independence and Public Accountability," acknowledged that public confidence in our institutions requires not just integrity, but the appearance of integrity, not just ethical behavior, but transparent ethical standards. While Roberts stopped short of endorsing specific reforms, the speech represented a significant shift from his previous position that the court's ethical standards were beyond legitimate criticism. Legal scholars noted that several phrases in the speech seemed to echo language from Jasmine's questioning, suggesting that her arguments had penetrated even the Chief Justice's carefully constructed worldview. The broader cultural impact of the 47 seconds continued to unfold in unexpected ways. High school civics classes began using the hearing as a case study in democratic accountability. College debate teams competed over questions of institutional reform inspired by Jasmine's arguments. Graduate schools of public administration incorporated her questioning technique into their curricula as an example of effective governmental oversight. Most profoundly, the hearing had demonstrated that individual citizens, properly prepared and strategically positioned, could still hold even the most powerful institutions accountable. In an era when many Americans felt powerless in the face of seemingly unresponsive government, Jasmine's example provided a roadmap for effective civic engagement that transcended traditional partisan divisions. The 47 seconds had proven that democracy wasn't just about voting every few years or hoping that elected officials would somehow represent public interests without constant pressure. It was about the daily work of citizenship, the preparation required for effective accountability, and the courage needed to speak truth to power even when that power seemed untouchable. As Jasmine reflected on the continuing impact of that Tuesday morning in room 2141, she understood that the trembling hand and faltering voice had been symbols of something larger than one man's discomfort. They had represented the vulnerability of any institution that claimed authority without accepting accountability, any leader who demanded respect without demonstrating integrity. The legend that had been born in those 47 seconds wasn't really about Jasmine Crockett, though she had become its embodiment. It was about the enduring power of individual courage to challenge systemic failures, the importance of preparation in the service of justice, and the fundamental democratic principle that no one, regardless of position or privilege, should be beyond the reach of legitimate accountability. The Chief Justice's mask had indeed fallen away, but what had been revealed underneath wasn't personal failure so much as institutional arrogance that had lost touch with the very principles it claimed to serve. And in that revelation, a nation had been reminded that its democracy was only as strong as its citizens' willingness to demand better from those who wielded power in their name. 1 year later, Jasmine stood before the same committee room where it had all begun, but this time as the lead sponsor of the Supreme Court Ethics and Transparency Act, legislation that had seemed impossible just 12 months earlier. The bill had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, a testament to how completely the political landscape had shifted since those 47 seconds. The act established binding ethical standards for Supreme Court justices, mandatory annual disclosure of financial relationships, and an independent review board to investigate potential violations. More importantly, it codified the principle that Jasmine had articulated so powerfully, that credibility was indeed currency, and American institutions could no longer operate on credit they hadn't earned. Chief Justice Roberts, who had initially opposed the legislation in private communications with congressional leadership, had eventually issued a public statement accepting the new requirements. "The court recognizes," his statement read, "that public confidence in our institution requires not just ethical behavior, but demonstrable commitment to the highest standards of transparency and accountability." The language was carefully neutral, but legal observers noted that several phrases seemed to echo directly from Jasmine's original questioning. The trembling hand had become a steady signature on reforms that would reshape the court for generations. As Jasmine prepared to speak at the bill's signing ceremony, her chief of staff handed her a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a young woman in Alabama who had just been accepted to law school. "I watched your questioning of the Chief Justice when I was a senior in high school," the letter read. "I decided that day that I wanted to be a lawyer who fights for accountability. Your 47 seconds changed my life direction. Thank you for showing me that truth-telling is the highest form of public service." Jasmine folded the letter carefully and placed it in her jacket pocket next to similar messages from students, attorneys, activists, and ordinary citizens who had found courage in her example. The real legacy of those 47 seconds wasn't institutional reform, though that mattered enormously. It was the inspiration it had provided to a generation of Americans who had learned that individual courage could still move mountains. When President Martinez called her name at the signing ceremony, Jasmine stepped forward to receive the pen that had just created the most significant judicial reform in 50 years. But as she held the pen that had made history, she thought about the trembling hand that had started it all. Power without accountability wasn't strength. It was vulnerability waiting to be exposed by someone brave enough to ask the right questions. In a democracy, no one was untouchable when faced with citizens prepared to demand answers and principled enough to fight for them. The 47 seconds had become a permanent reminder that courage, preparation, and moral clarity could still reshape the balance of power in American government. The legend would live on, not in the history books, but in every future generation that refused to accept, because that's how we've always done it, as an answer to questions about justice and accountability. Democracy, Jasmine had proven, was not a spectator sport. It required active citizenship, fearless questioning, and the understanding that institutions were only as honest as the people brave enough to challenge them. If this story of individual courage standing up to institutional power inspired you, we want to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments that define American democracy. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's questioning technique? Could you have maintained that level of composure while taking on the Chief Justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who believes that accountability should apply to everyone, regardless of how powerful they think they are. We'll see you in the next video, where we explore how Jasmine's confrontation changed the way Congress approaches Supreme Court oversight, and why other justices are now facing questions they never expected to answer.